Glock Talk, what by God's grace may become a mini-series here, because a lot of you guys like Glocks. I myself have been carrying Glocks professionally about 20 years now, even though I don't really like them. But some we'll probably dig into. But I do know my way around a Glock. Today, let's talk about the different generations of Glocks. We're on the 6th now, if you don't count some of the weird ones in between. So if that interests you, stay tuned. Welcome to the podcast where we talk about guns, gunfighting, tactics, even Glocks, right? All manner of gun and gun-related stuff the right way, with God Almighty at the center. Biblical, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world first-hand experience. Military, law enforcement, private security, contracting, hunting, competition shooting, handgun instructor, firearms instructor. So that's some bona fides, bullet points in the show notes. Blessed be the Lord my rock, who trains my hands for war and my fingers for battle. All right, let's start off with what started it all, at least on the American market. There might have been some prototypes I'm not privy to, but the Glock Gen 1 17, the OG, original Glock, right? So the Gen 1's actually a really good generation of Glock. They're kind of collector's items now, but ironically, if you look at the Gen 1, it's probably more similar to the Gen 5 than any other generation. I think they kind of got off topic for a while. But the Gen 1 is good, with the exception of you can't mount anything to the front of it. It doesn't have an accessory rail. They weren't really the pick rail wasn't really a thing then. You can't fault them for that. But the Gen 1 Glock 17, good to go. As far as Glocks go, with decent, it was pretty revolutionary as far as success on the market. It was not the first gun with polygonal rifling. It was not the first gun with a plastic frame. It's certainly not the first striker-fired gun. But it was the first mass successful gun to wrap all those things up and put a bow on it and sell it to the American consumer. Their Glock marketing is genius. There's a whole book on Glock, and if you read it, that marketing part is pretty fascinating. But the Gen 1, good, simple, 9mm, I think is the only one it was available in. I think there was only the 17 and the 19. Could be wrong about that. But the Gen 1, good, simple Glock, laid out some of the groundwork for things Glock would be known for. Simplicity, rugged, polymer frame, polygonal rifling, the blocky ergonomics, right? So it kind of laid the foundation for all that stuff. The Gen 2s, I'm actually not super familiar with the Gen 2s, how they differ from the Gen 1s. I think only minor. The big one that's been around a long time is the Gen 3. I was issued a Gen 3. It was my duty gun for L.A.P.D, the Glock 22, 40 cal. Pretty horrible gun. Partly because it's a Glock and partly because it was 40 caliber. But I carried that for a while. I also carried many other Glocks on duty. I switched to a Glock 21 when I was a huge caliber warrior. Carried that for a while, the 21 and the 21C, which doesn't exist anymore, I don't think. But anyway, carried those on duty for a while. The Gen 3 is a very good gen for aftermarket stuff. And the patent on it is expired, and it was around for so long that there is so much aftermarket stuff for it. Many of the quote-unquote clones of Glocks, and that's a hazy gray line as to what is a Glock clone and what isn't a Glock clone, because is any plastic, polymer, striker-fired handgun a Glock clone? I don't know. But the very more specific clones are generally going to be clones of the Gen 3. Why? Because the patent's expired, and it was widely accepted. It was, I don't know number sold, but way, way more numbers sold of the Gen 3 than the Gen 1 and 2. So it was the first mass American market one that was really popular. And part of this has to do with the assault weapons ban that sunsetted, thankfully, that garbage that I had to grow up with. But Yeah, you younger shooters have never had to put up with that, but we lived in a nation that was basically as horrible as California for a time as far as gun laws go. It was a sad black eye on American history and the Second Amendment. But when that sunsetted, the Glock 3 became massively popular because before that you couldn't have high-capacity handguns. You couldn't have high-capacity handgun magazines, which kind of defeated the purpose of having a Glock, right? So, the Gen 3 massively popular. The Gen 3 kept the polygonal rifling a really good finish. Tennifer, I think, was still used then. It's real simple. It's probably one of the simplest ones. It's probably the best one if you're a tinkerer, if you just want a donor action, right? It's got that simple recoil system. It's just a guide rod and a spring. So if you shoot a ton or if you want to tune your recoil system, many Glock shooters will just never wear out a recoil spring. But if you're an avid shooter, competition shooter, you may go through a couple springs in a season or a spring in a training class. You might shoot a couple of thousand rounds a week. So the fact that you can just buy bulk springs for $6 or $7 a piece and just replace them every couple thousand rounds as you're supposed to, guys. The Gen 3 is really good for that. Later they would go to the dual recoil spring, the more complex spring. But the Gen 3 is probably the easiest to work on, the most aftermarket parts. The Gen 3 is really good for that. The sad part of the Gen 3 is a couple of things. The Gen 3 trigger's decent, but the stippling or the lack thereof, like the texture is horrible. It's it has very little texture to it at all. It's a poor texture. Back in the day, we would just put skateboard tape. Now they make tailor-made grip tapes for handguns. Back in the day, you just use skateboard tape and super glue, maybe some sand, and or you would just take a Dremel to it or a heat gun. I would do it with back in the day. I would do it with just a heating iron, and I would just heat that up and stipple it. But the texture on those are pretty bad, and also they suffer from the affliction of finger grooves. Finger grooves are horrible on anything. If you think you want anything with a finger groove, just repent. I don't know. Do a cold plunge or a Tide Pod challenge or something and get over that. But you don't. Finger grooves are horrible. It has finger grooves. So you can also take a Dremel and remove the finger grooves. But the operating system is very much simple. And again, the first mass available, mass popular Glock model, and the one whose patent is expired, which spawned a plethora of clones. The Grey Ghost, the Zev Tech, the Shadow Systems, the Ruger RMX, and probably some others I'm forgetting are pretty much based on the Gen 3 Glock. So and again, the most aftermarket parts, aftermarket support is available for those Gen 3s, the easiest to work on if you're a tinkerer aftermarket guy. Then the Gen 4, where I think Glock kind of went downhill. The Gen 4 to me is the worst generation. It has a worse trigger than the Gen 3, if you can believe that. You take a horrible trigger and just pour some sand in it and make it even grittier and nastier. The Gen 4 is bad. When I took this private security contracting job, thankfully not anymore, but my current one, believe it or not, we went back in time 20 years, and they were still issuing 40 cal, which is horrible. My choices were a Gen 3 or a Gen 4 Glock 22. Ugh. It's Anyway, I chose the Gen 3 over the Gen 4 because it's got a slightly better trigger. The Gen 4 has a worse trigger, in my opinion. But it does have a better texture. It still kept the finger grooves, which is horrible, but it gave you a better texture. Now, Glock for a while was experimenting with the textures. They had an RTF1 and an RTF2. They went with the RTF2. I think the RTF1 was by far better. If you can find one of those, kind of a collector item, but the RTF1 had a really good grip texture to it. I think people thought it was too aggressive. The average, soccer mom or whomever didn't like it because it was too aggressive. But if you want to shoot fast and run the gun hard, that RTF1 was better. But they went with the RTF2. That was still way better than the grip texture on the Gen 3. So it had that. You generally didn't have to stipple it out of the box. You might, round off some finger grooves, undercut the trigger guard. But in general, the texture was pretty decent. So there's that. The Gen 4 also introduced the back straps. Most people don't use the back straps. You generally want, unless you just have giant hands, like you're 7 foot tall, 400 pounds, you probably don't want the back straps. You generally want a handgun grip to be as small as it can be, because that's how, ergonomics work. That's how biomechanics work. The smaller the grip, the generally tighter you can grip something. To illustrate this, go to a pull-up bar, one that's like an inch wide and one that's 2 inches wide, like a fat pull-up bar, and try to do as many pull-ups as you can. You'll do far more on the smaller pull-up bar. You can grab it harder. That's how that works. So generally, I would advise against any back straps on your Glocks unless you are really, really a big dude. But yeah, they came out with a back strap thing. It was kind of like, well, one, because the Smith & Wesson was so much better at the time, in my opinion. And they had a really good exchangeable backstrap system. Glock does what it does often, is like, well, we have this thing. How can we do the minimum thing possible to say that we have it too? So they added the back straps on the Gen 4. Again, mostly useless, but that did come out with the Gen 4. They still kept the polygonal barrel. And and they went to the more complex recoil spring system. So there was that. It went to like a dual captured recoil spring. This was the earlier gens, the really small Glocks, the baby Glocks, the 26, the 27, they had this, but they put it in all their models. It is, I'm going to be honest, it is a better system for controlling recoil and stuff, the more complex recoil spring. It also has a bigger hole in the front, so you generally can't swap those back and forth between generations. You have to get like an adapter. But yeah, so more complex recoil spring system in the Gen 4s. And I think, I'm not looking this stuff up, but I think if memory serves, this is when you could swap back and forth the magazine release on side. So if you're a lefty, there you go. Okay, now the Gen 5 was a big improvement, in my opinion, over many of the previous gens, going back to like the Gen 1. But it had a simpler pin system. It had less pins than the other generations. They went away from 40 because 40 is garbage and it should have never been a thing, but it was a thing. But once the 40 was dead, they went back to the more simpler pin system, closer to like the Gen 1s. They didn't need, because you weren't destroying guns with that, high pressure, violent system of the 40. They went back to a simpler pin system. With the Gen 5, I guess I figured they didn't need it anymore. And the Gen 5 also doesn't have finger grooves. Oh, so nice, right? The Gen 5 does not have finger grooves. The Gen 5 has a flared mag well. The Gen 5 kept the good texturing. And the Gen 5, in my opinion, has a better trigger than any of the previous gens. I don't know if I remember what a Gen 1 trigger feels like, but the Gen 5 certainly over the Gen 3 and the Gen 4 has a better trigger. The Gen 5 is kind of, if you're going to shoot a Glock, the Gen 5 is pretty good, right? It's what I currently carry on duty. So there's that. It does have that good grip texture again. It does have the ambidextrous and slightly larger magazine release, which I like. It has a big improvement, the marksman barrel, which got away from the polygonal rifling. I could probably do a whole episode on polygonal rifling versus traditional rifling. But polygonal rifling has its benefits, right? It's much easier to clean those older gen Glocks, right? If you don't shoot garbage ammo through them, like lead, you're not supposed to shoot lead through those older barrels. But if you're not shooting lead ammo, or you're not shooting like steel case garbage or nasty third world crap out of your Glock, then you probably could go the entire life of the Glock and never clean that barrel, and it will probably be okay. The polygonal rifling just stays clean, those older Tennifer finishes are really slick. I think the Gen 5s went away from that older Tennifer finish because they got sued by, I don't know, some environmental group or something, I don't know, but they went to a different finish. It's still really good, whatever they call the new finish. It's not Tennifer. It's still a really good finish. They went to the marksman barrel, which is traditionally rifled, and it's much more accurate. If you're struggling to shoot a silhouette at 25 yards, you don't care. It doesn't matter to you. But if you actually are trying to like sink headshots at 50 yards or shoot precisely, that new marksman barrel is much, much better. I think they did that in order to win if memory serves correct, they did that to get the F.B.I. contract because they wanted a gun accurate enough to actually meet the standard. But it's a better barrel. They kept that. It's a decent barrel. The older barrels, the quality on them is fine. It's just they weren't made for accuracy. They're meant to dump rounds in a general direction. That's kind of philosophy of Glock. Go bang and throw rounds in the general direction I want it to go. And they did that. But the newer generation barrels are better, I think a little bit more precise. So it's got the marksman barrel. That's a big improvement. So the Gen 5, decent improvements. Trying to think, did I say flared mag well? I think that's basically, in my opinion, a better trigger than the previous gens. So the Gen 5, they were going back in the right direction. Probably, again, better than all the other gens since the Gen 1. And I think I forgot to mention, but the Gen 3s, they had the accessory rail, and all the ones going forward had the accessory rail. So that's the Gen 5. The Gen 6, I only have rudimentary experience with, as I have handled one. I don't own one. I haven't really driven one. But the Gen 6 seems to do a lot of the things that the aftermarket community does. Some improvements, I think flared mag well, undercut trigger guard, better ergonomics, although they kept the Glock grip angle, which they're probably going to. They're kind of known for that, right? But interchangeable back straps, which nobody really cares about generally, but undercut trigger. It's got a flat face trigger, which I prefer. I like a flat face trigger when I can get it. Flat face trigger, that's a big improvement to me. Although the trigger poundage may be the same, the fact that you have a flat trigger generally means it feels much better. And when I handled it, it felt much better than a regular Glock trigger. So that Glock Gen 6 has a good trigger. I think they factory undercut the trigger guard. You may have to double check that. They also cut a little shelf into the side of the Glock. Again, a lot of these things are people we've been doing with Dremels for a long time, but they just did it from the factory. I think they all have the Ford's cocking serrations, which came out on later, like one of the in-betweens in the Gen 5 series, front cocking serrations. Not a big deal. You should be man enough to be able to cock a Glock slide from the front if you want to with or without serrations, but it's kind of a nice to have there. They simplified their model line. They discontinued a bunch of models. I don't know how many they will come out with in the Gen 6, but I think right now it's like the 19, the 17, and the 45. So there's that. The Gen 6 seems to be continuing to go in the right direction. Especially one of the big drawbacks of the Glock is the trigger. And there's a lot of aftermarket stuff, but you got to be careful with the aftermarket triggers. We'll probably get into its own episode for that. But when you start doing aftermarket stuff to the trigger to make it better, you generally, decrease the reliability, or you certainly can decrease reliability, which is really one of the only things Glock has going for it is the reliability. So, the Glock Gen 6 seems to have a better trigger. That's a big deal. Now let's go off on some tangents here and talk about some of the intermittent stuff that wasn't actually a generation, but they had the C models, which were compensated, and unlike a lot of other guns that are compensated in the front, they have cuts in the side of or in the top of the slide, like elongated cuts on either side, like a V, and they have the ports cut directly into the barrel. These are good. I like them better than a regular Glock, which isn't setting the bar real low. But they're cool. They're good to have if you want a compensated gun. The Glock C models, they've been around since at least the Gen 3s. There was also the SF model. This is pre-backstrap era, but because the bigger framed Glocks like the 20 and the 21 were so obese, they did a little bit to try and slim them down, put them on a diet. That was the SF model. A brief interlude there before the backstraps came in. There's also the I mentioned earlier, the RTF1, if you can find those. They also have a cool half moon kind of cut out in the slide as opposed to just straight lines. I think that was a better design. I wish they'd have kept that, but they kind of abandoned it. But if you can find the RTF1 models, those are fantastic. Really cool grip texture there. That was a brief interlude there. They also come out with the slimline Glocks to compete with the Smith & Wesson M&P Shield. So they came out with they always had the baby Glocks, the 26s and the 27s, but they came out with I don't know what gen you would consider them, but they came out with the Glock 42 and then the Glock 43 and the Glock 48. Those are all slimline Glocks. The original slimline Glock is kind of massively forgotten. It's not really its own generation or anything, but it's the Glock 36. This was around a long time. It used to be one of my concealed carry guns back in the day. But a Glock 36 is a slim line 45 ACP, kind of a forgotten Glock there. But and it kind of an in-between generations thing. There was the Glock 19X, the peanut butter Glock, the loser Glock that lost the U.S. military trials, I think for very good reason. You might disagree if you're a Glock fanboy, but I'm glad that thing failed to get any mass adoption in the military. But that was the one, and I think that kind of was like a key development part of the Gen 5. But the Glock 19X, the peanut butter Glock, it's one of the few Glocks that comes from the factory, anything other than black, which to me black is one of the worst worst colors for anything tactical. But the peanut butter Glock, kind of the wrong thing to me. I don't want a long, especially if I'm carrying the gun, which is the point that I have a handgun. I don't want a long handle and a short barrel. Like that doesn't make any sense to me. Like it's completely wrong. I would rather have the longer barrel and the shorter grip because I want to actually shoot the gun and carry it. So anyway, it's just kind of on paper it looks good. You got high capacity and a smaller gun, but when you actually go to shoot it, you're like, what are we doing here? But the 19X, kind of an interim introducing the Gen 5, I think, so introduce some of the Gen 5 features. Also, the MOS system came in. I don't think it was introduced when the Gen 5 came out, but the MOS system, their optics mounting system, much like the back straps, it's like a hashtag Me Too. Everybody's mounting optics. What can we do as minimal as possible to say that we can theoretically mount a optic on our handguns? The Glock slides are just way too thin for that. That was a horrible system. It's probably the worst factory mounting system I've ever seen for mounting optics on a handgun, and I've mounted quite a few optics on handguns. The MOS system is just bad. If you have an older Glock or an MOS, if you have an older Glock and you want to mount an optic, just have it directly cut and the biggest screws you can get to directly mount into that optic. The MOS system is just bad, in my opinion. Probably the worst one I've seen for mounting optics. Now, I think, thankfully, the Gen 6, they got a better optics mounting system. I believe. You'd have to double-check this. Again, I don't own a Gen 6, but you would have to, I think you'd have to work hard to do worse than the MOS. So if it's anything other than the MOS system, which I think it is probably better. So they do have a new optics mounting system on the Gen 6. But that's kind of an interim. Again, that MOS, that optics mounting system kind of came out way after the Gen 5 was reintroduced. My Gen 5 that I've had and I've shot and I've done a bunch of training and stuff. I've had the Gen 5 now has been out a long time. It seems like to me that's still like the new Glock, but I guess it's been out quite a while. But the optics mounting wasn't really a big thing even when the Gen 5 came out. But the Gen 6 I think has a better optics mounting system. The MOS system was adopted kind of interim in between the generations, and a lot of the Gen 5s don't have those. A couple of other interim things, the Marksman, I think it's called the Marksman trigger, the Pro trigger. They're from the factory, kind of better upgraded trigger. I hear mixed things about those. They're certainly better than the Glock factory trigger, which again set the bar real low, but I've heard that they also gum up really quickly, like if you're doing hard use stuff with them. So there's that. That's kind of an interim thing as well. But this one, I don't want to get too far off topic. This was mostly just about the different generations of Glock. So hopefully, again, God willing, this will be a mini-series on Glock talk. We'll talk about some other stuff with Glock, maybe how to shoot a Glock well if you must shoot a Glock, how to best practices, do's and don'ts for modifying your Glock, good aftermarket sites that I prefer, things like that. Again, for as much as I don't like Glocks, again, I've carried them professionally for just about 20 years now. Used them on the street. I've carried them as a private security contractor. I have won competitions with them. I actually shot a perfect score. I got a Glock 500 patch, which is a hard thing to do, shooting a perfect score with a Glock, like a perfect 500 score. If you know what that is, But it's just kind of it's a hard thing to do. So I can shoot a Glock, right? I can run them. Why would I handicap myself when I don't have to? But you can get decent work done with a Glock. Like I carry one now professionally because, the reason they get all the contracts, the cheapest bidder. Like what gun can we get that checks a box that we have to do very little maintenance on and we can technically get to pass the qual with. So again, I've carried Glock professionally for like 20-ish years, right? So a lot of you guys carry Glocks, despite my urging otherwise. And if we're going to do that, right? If we have to do that or we're going to do that, we should do it as best as we can. So hopefully this will expand, again, God willing, into a mini-series on other aspects of Glock and how to shoot Glocks. I probably won't do an entire one on our marketing scheme, but anyway, mini-series on Glock. So if you like the Glock talk, stay tuned. Make sure you're subscribed. Share with somebody that's a Glock aficionado or a Glock fanboy or not. That maybe not if they're a Glock fanboy. They might not like me talking about Glocks if I don't just say everything they do is wonderful. But thanks. Like, subscribe, share, all the things. If you want more insider content, Patreon, we're doing a ton of Glock talk on there. It kind of had its own spinoff thing. But Patreon, there should be a Patreon link in the show notes. If you want to support all the buzzwords, small business, U.S. owned and operated, veteran owned and operated. Every single employee of this company is a veteran because there's one employee, myself. So all the buzzwords, right? If you want to support, become a patron, mostly because you like and want to support the podcast. But also, there's a lot. There's like thousands of, pieces of content on Patreon, on my Patreon page. And a lot of really cool insider-only content. I'm usually a little bit more raw, a little bit more honest on there. So if you want to check that out, there should be a Patreon link in the show notes. With that, your tactical tip of the day. Most Glock people don't run the factory plastic Glock sights. So if you're going to switch those out, if you're going to run your gun hard, you're likely to break iron sights at some point. So you might as well keep those plastic ones that come with the gun, and you may as well put those in the grip. You can just take a piece of tape or something and shove them up in that hollow space in the back of the grip. That hollow space in the back of the grip does serve a purpose. Maybe we'll get to that when shooting a Glock if you must episode. But that hollow space back there does serve a purpose, and it's not to hold extra parts, but you can also hold extra parts back there. Put a piece of tape around there so they don't fall out. If you have one of those cool fancy grip plugs, you can put them in there. But in case you break your sights that are on the gun, you have backup sights on there. Also, maybe put an extra trigger spring back there. That's a part that's sometimes breaks on Glocks. Yeah, Glocks do break. So you might put those spare parts back there in that space behind the grip. And that made me think of another tactical tip. I'll give you two. If you are going to just run those factory Glock sights, get rid of that white U-notch in the back. If you're shooting fast, you don't want a bunch of this stuff to confuse your eyes. You want to focus on the front sight, just like the 3 dots, horrible system. You just want 1 dot. You want the bright thing to be on the front sight because that's where you need to focus. So the factory Glock sights have that big white U in the back. Take a Sharpie and color it in, or what I like even better, because those sights come out real easy, is just tap the sight out and turn it around so that the entire back, which used to be the front, is black. So you have black, then you have white. You take a small round file, like a jeweler's file, the same width as the sight, and you carve out the bottom of the sight so you can actually see the entire dot in the front of the sight. So instead of like a square notch, you get more of a U notch. And that, if you're going to run the factory sights, that's a vast improvement that's pretty much free, assuming you have a file. So there's some tactical tips for you there. Your tactical verse of the day. It's funny how you can read the Bible, and sometimes a verse just that has never jumped out to you before just jumps out to you. But here's a good one from the book of 1 Kings. And act and give to everyone according to his ways, whose heart you know, for you alone know the hearts of all the sons of men. Just, of course, we know that God is amazing and that he knows all things, but just to remember that he knows our hearts. You can't get one over on God. You can't fool God. You might fool your fellow man. You might fool your preacher. You might fool even your wife, but you're not fooling God. He even knows the intents of your heart. So that should humble us and remember what a great and amazing God we serve. With that, man, thank you for listening and have a blessed day.